Okay, welcome everybody. I'm just going to acknowledge again that we're meeting here today on Gadigal land. Very lucky to be here on such a beautiful Sydney day. Welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce you to our panel. The first panel we have today is Inside the Confession Machine. Put up your hand if you like memoir. Yeah. Put up your hand if you write memoir. Put up your hand if it's difficult to write memoir. Yeah, lots to go on in memoir. I love reading memoir, but I can imagine some of the challenges that might come up in writing memoir and writing about your family, your friends, your people. So we're going to hear a lot about that today in this panel. I'm going to introduce you to Addi. Is it Addi? We have Miro Bilbrough, and we have Sheila Fanner. Thank you, Sheila. And Sheila's going to be running this panel. And I'm going to pass this mic over. Give them a round of applause, please.
Thanks, Miriam. Thanks so much for coming to the session. It's the first of the day, and we thought we'd save the juiciest one for, to kick it all off. It's such a pleasure for me to be here today with Miro Bilbrough and Addi. They've both written brilliant books, which I highly recommend, and I'm not just saying that because I'm hosting this panel, but it's actually their work that actually inspired me to create this particular panel, because I found that I actually really responded to their works in a way that made me think that I think really good writing, you can basically relate across difference, and even though these people might have very different lives to the reader, I think really beautiful memoir really kind of makes you feel like there is something that you have, you share in common. And even if you don't relate to all of it, I think that is the beauty of memoir. But it's a fraught genre though, and I think, as you know, if you're a memoir reader, there are a lot of questions about memoir these days, which I think are good to ask. And so if you are familiar with their books at all, they actually took very different approaches though to the topic of memoir, to the subject of memoir, and very different approaches actually. So Miro's book, which is called In the Time of the Manaroans, it's essentially like hundreds of vignettes about the life that she had growing up in New Zealand in the 70s. And whereas Addi's book is a book of personal essays, and that's set more in like the last 20 years or so. And so I think that it's interesting, I guess, for me to sit here as someone who's sort of between them in terms of generation and from a different cultural background too, but just thinking about how, even though they're very different books, I actually thought there was quite a lot of crossover, quite interesting crossover points as well. And so I wanted to explore that with them. And one of the main things that I think that they have in common, and maybe this is the same with lots of memoir, is that a lot of the writing here deals with family inheritance. And what is it that we inherit from our families? And how do we grapple with that legacy? And in fact, Addi's book, Root and Branch, I think is very much kind of explicitly dealing with that, because she's kind of chosen the metaphor of a tree, and the subtitle of the book is Essays on Inheritance. So I will leave question time at the end, so if you have any questions, please kind of save that, and we'll definitely try to get to them. But I might start off first with you, Miro, and look at your book first. So as I mentioned, it's a book about a childhood in New Zealand, but it's a very atypical childhood. And essentially, Miro's kind of grown up in a kind of a hippie commune. I guess that's one way to say it, even though you do say in your book that the word hippie isn't quite right for the New Zealand context, but it's the best word you could think of. And I thought she did a really good job of being very restrained and very compassionate towards parents who weren't really there for you during that time. And I wondered if you could start off by maybe reading a little bit about your time in the commune, the community chest.
Okay, the community chest. So this is a bit of a. Sorry, how's that? Is that right? Yep. So this is sort of a bit of a deep dive, a bit subatomic in the level of detail. We're right deep in the commune now. I'm 15. I've moved there from a share flat situation just to get a bit of parenting. It's a bit of last minute parenting. And yes, I've just finished school, so I'm actually 16, sorry. And I'm in this sort of extended section, I'm kind of discussing the layout of the main house, the community house. Everybody lives off the community house in carcase houses and caravans, but the main house is where we gather. The storeroom, I'll just do the Marrickville pause for the play. Yes, no pause. So, community chest. I'll just say that Manaroa is set kind of 3.5 hours by mail boat. It's probably about 5 hours by road, most of it untarsealed, deep in the Pelorus Sound, which is sort of at the top of that labyrinthine waterway at the top of the South Island. So it's very isolated, and we're very, very poor. We don't believe in welfare. We do seasonal work, and we eat very badly. So anyway, the community chest. The storeroom also houses the community chest, whose mythological reputation precedes acquaintance. This huge trunk provides the basis for a revolving shared wardrobe. It is fathomless, the community chest. When our blasted nuclear unit eventually shifts from the flood house, and in my case, Nelson, that's the share flat, to Manaroa, I am immediately embroiled in the community chest's inexhaustible charms. New stuff seems to manifest there day by day, but only if you dig. Then it is as if in upturning the pile, you don't just throw up new combinations, but bring new things into being. Magical and kaleidoscopic it is. Between argyle vests and fringed brocade bedspreads, pilled knits, old man pinstripes and 40s lapels, there is suddenly something wafty and unguessed at to be fished out. A rust-coloured dress of post-war crepe, only lightly stained, or a stiff square of transparent mint organza to drape over afternoon teas we shan't be having. Once, deep in days of not much, I plucked from the community chest a strapless baby blue taffeta sheath with a layer of jewel-encrusted lace sculpting the torso. I am an instant teenage bombshell. With nowhere to go in this outlandish borrowed glamour, I take a turn of the Manaroa kitchen garden. I find Kate's lover, Rob, crouched in a dirt row, weeding lettuces. A light-boned, often overcast man, Rob is maybe not my best prospect. I clear my throat. Probably worth saying that all the other community members are sort of adults in their late 20s. I'm the only adolescent. I clear my throat. Rob looks up. The harsh New Zealand light impales my unlikely vision. I feel like Mae West, but without the high scriptwriter or improvisational talent. I say something idiotic in a phony voice to signal that I'm in on the joke, like, "Hi, honey," or "Want a party?" Except that halfway through, I fuck it up, swallow, and lose the voice. Nor is Rob a happy object of my attentions. He's so embarrassed, he's angry. He mutters, cuts off his stare, and returns to weeding. Oh, he thinks I'm trying to make a fool of him. Rob has been making me feel stupid ever since I arrived at Manaroa. He is, above all, a master of refusing to answer questions. Work it out, we'll say, with a double smile when I inquire into some new procedure or custom. Doesn't he realise that my guileless inanities are mostly intended as entrees to some better, deeper, more rewarding conversation? Not for Rob, small talk, or dress-ups. I turn around and go back inside in my taffeta and lace, shamed but not completely dashed. This pale blue bombshell number is maybe just not the dress you wear for an early afternoon tour of the lettuces.
Thanks, Miro, and for explaining the context. So that's just one of the many vignettes that make up this incredible story. And I know that you've touched on some of these memories and ideas through your work as a filmmaker, but I wondered, why did you feel the need to write an actual memoir about this?
Well, it was a sort of many-pronged answer, I guess. I think that I made a couple of feature films. I'd never got to Manaroa, but I'd certainly dealt with my father's flood house in sort of lightly fictionalised form. you know, sometimes more successfully than others. And I just kind of reached a point where I wanted total creative control. Film is just so, it's sort of, you're gifted with collaborators, and that's its first, you know, its best kind of, its virtue and its horror, really. You know, and I started as a creative on the page. I started as a prose poet, and it was just this kind of time to return. I was in my early 50s, and I'd just been spat out of a creative arts doctorate, and I felt like my language had kind of been so formalised, and there were so many things I wasn't allowed to do. And when I came out of it, I said to my partner, Jeremy, I'm not going to be anybody's bitch now. And I really felt like that, and I sat down and I wrote the first 10,000 words in a week, which for me is just because I come from being a poet, right? So I'm usually snail's pace. So it was just sort of, it was waiting to be written, and it was the right time.
I mean, I can understand the PhD restriction as well, but I mean, so in that sense, was it like a catharsis then? Is that what you're saying? Like, not necessarily from the early childhood, but even from like the restriction of like, you know, being forced to conform to a particular way of writing and thinking.
I sort of thought of it at the time as a palate cleanser. You know, I was just sort of like cleaning my palate. It wasn't cathartic in the sense that I just had too good a time, I think. I really just did have a good time, and you know, I'd had some good times in the doctorate as well, but they were almost other people's good times. I can't really describe it. Yeah.
But I mean, and I guess that with the memoir though, you're thinking back to like things that have happened, I guess more than like 30, 40 years ago.
Yes.
And yet the detail you have is like incredible. Like, so how were you able to sort of cast your mind back and reach into like that community chest and remember that dress? Like, where did that come from?
Well, I think I was saying to someone the other day that my first drawings, when I started drawing, I just drew clothes. Like, you know, there'd be people in them, but they were very obsessively detailed. And when I was saying it, I said maybe I was drawing clothes to clothe my mother, because she spent most of the time being naked. And I, you know, which I was pretty scared someone was going to come back with me from school and discover my mother naked. So I'm being a bit facetious, but I was always clothes obsessed. I think that, you know, the way in for me was sort of materiality. So, and it was a very, you know, it was almost slightly pre-industrial world. We didn't have running water. We certainly didn't have phones, but we didn't have a phone. We had a battery-operated ghetto blaster, you know. We couldn't always afford the batteries. So it was very sensate to me, qualities of light. The other thing I would just say quickly is that once you start writing, you start remembering, and your memory kind of leapfrogs, doesn't it, on detail, and you kind of can't stop remembering then, and it wakes you up in the night. Yeah,
and I think maybe what you're describing, I mean, and just to explain, I mean, the life that you had was pre-industrial, but other people didn't have that life. There's a bit in your book where you have this friend and you go to her house, and it's like, it feels almost like American, because they eat processed food and like TV or something. And yet the life that your parents have chosen, and I guess especially your father, he kind of had dropped out and sort of opted out of that. And so I guess the one sense that I got from reading your book is it's so visceral, because there's so much manual labor involved. Like, you know, there's no washing machines. You're washing your clothes by hand. You're growing lettuce, you know, like in the ground, trying to be self-sufficient. But I guess in a way it was also like a failed experiment too overall. I mean, is that how you felt at the time when you know, now you're writing it in your 50s, so you're looking back, but you have to try and cast your mind back to your teenage self writing this.
I think that there was a weird sort of combination of, I think even then I thought it was brave. It was sort of an amazing experiment to be caught up in. But I will also say, and I think why all of us had trouble with the term hippies, is it always seemed so Californian and sort of flaky and love and peace. And I have to say that Manaroans was just, you know, a household of deep skeptics. So you know, there was just a really funny combination. I actually think that some of the cynicism and skepticism got in the way of the flourishing, and that it was a house, it was a very anarchic place. So we were flouting so many rules that, you know, there was one character we just used to call the Stoned Monolith, because he was always stoned and he was always on the sofa, you know, and so, you know, that kind of thing is a real impediment to a kind of flourishing project of self-sufficiency, because everyone was acting out and rebelling and anti-authoritarian. Plus we were living on, in some ways, the poorest land. You know, it was deep, deep clay. You could, you know, I've forgotten the name of the instrument, of the tool, but you would, you know, you'd be hacking at this deep clay to plant a garden, and then the possums would eat it. So it was very tough. Yeah.
And just to clarify too, I mean, this land wasn't inhabited at all, right? It wasn't that it was settled even by the Maori either.
Well, the Marlborough Sounds has pretty interesting history, because of course it was Maori land, but it was a sort of site of early contact, because the whalers and sealers came through there and sort of set up kind of provisional sort of, you know, transitory house. But the area we were in, we didn't know the Maori history. It was owned by two sort of slightly abject, kind of wonderful farmers who were probably the only people in the Sounds, or some of the few, that it's a very conservative area politically, very, very conservative. But Mick and Addi decided to rent this land, this unfarmable land, to us for a peppercorn rent. And I think they were very intrigued by our sort of antic cavalcade and what we might do with it. I think we were probably light entertainment. Yeah, and they were generous, very, very generous. I don't know what the rent was. It was probably $4 a year or something we could afford.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I guess hearing you describe that, now I'm going to bring Addi into this, because Addi took a very different approach to, you know, thinking through memoir. I mean, in fact, the book is more about personal essay, so it means she leans on other references too. But I guess hearing about what Miro says, Miro is describing to me like something like a community that's sort of self-imposed exile as well. And I mean, today, maybe not to be too clumsy about it, but Addi's, a lot of her book and her writing focuses more on like the Turkish diaspora and other aspects of exile as well. And I think the way you've you know, chosen to do it though, I mean, Addi's style is very funny. I don't know if you're familiar with her work in the Sydney Review of Books, and I think she finds a lot of humour within quite a lot of difficult and traumatic circumstances as well, which is something that I gravitate towards personally as well, as I also identify from coming from a diaspora. But I wanted to sort of kick things off for Addi. I wondered if you could read the first part of your essay, Tell All, which was published in the Sydney Review of Books.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sheila. Let me just... So I was practicing this before I came here, and there is a section towards the end that requires an ability to act that I do not possess. It's kind of like a section where someone is slurring drunkenly, but in the absence of actually not, in the absence of being drunk, I cannot do it. So can you just in your heads think of me slurring when I get to that section? Okay, cool. Tell all. Another abandoned book project of mine is a memoir, which is not like this book at all. It omits nothing, says everything, or most of it, and the narrative starts from the start of the story and goes till the end. I stopped writing it 2 years ago. Not for lack of interest, but for lack of understanding, maybe. I shit you not, I have seen things you people wouldn't believe. But why should I tell anyone about it? I stopped because I realized that forcing someone to look at me is no guarantee that I will be seen. How could I write about, say, my experience with a cult that abused and traumatized a loved one among tens of others, culminating in a court case in which the offender was acquitted and the complainant's victim blamed publicly? How could I when I'm steeped in a culture which views cults as a joke, something to meme or dedicate a season of a tween TV show to, or an episode of a podcast to, or to make into merchandise? I listen to true crime podcasts because I'm obsessed with trauma, like picking out a scab. I'm so scabby that in order to access a podcast online only content, I pay to register as a member of the fan cult. As an unwanted reward for my purchases, I've received a pin, a t-shirt, and a hat bearing that phrase. I can barely look at these items, let alone wear them. It's humorless of me. When I was younger, I would hang out on Omegle, text only, chatting to strangers, and once one of my interlocutors wrote, "I seek to understand, whereas you wait to be understood," and then our connection was lost. A friend who is a memoirist and I talk about the compulsion to disclose over drinks at the Commercial Hotel in Parramatta. She's just about to publish her memoir and she prods me to hurry up and finish mine. We agreed to meet here in this same place again in exactly 2 years and discuss my book the same way we have just done with hers. Unpacking our anxieties about saying certain things publicly for the first time. I even make a show of slotting the date into my calendar, holding my phone's screen up, facing outwards to show her. But I suspect I won't really do it, and nor, angry this time at no one and myself, can anyone make me. You could poke and prod me, but I ain't squealing. And yet, like her, I want to make disclosures, endlessly. I want to build intimacies to overcome the sense that this is so fucking mundane. That we, freshly emotionally regulated full-time job holding perfect subjects of neoliberalism, are now trapped in a prison and pretending like we don't want to talk incessantly about one of three things. Trauma, sex, and anti-capitalism. Are we... Thank you. Are we ever thinking about anything but these things? The way that any sleepover builds this heterotopic space, which devolves and opens up necessarily into a conversation about fucking. The way that every game of Never Have I Ever is about fucking. The way that we all want to say to each other what the worst thing we've ever done is, and be forgiven. On the true crime podcast I listen to, one of the hosts, whom I love and adore, does a bit which sends the other host without fail into peals of laughter. This is the part where I'm slurring. Shh, she slurs. I want to tell you a secret, acting drunk. And you just know, although you can't see her, that she's imitating leaning over real close to you at a bar. Let me tell you a secret. I want to tell you a secret. And that's the excerpt.
Thanks, Addi. Well, I thought that was a good passage to pick because obviously it deals explicitly with this idea of confession and memoir. And just kind of following on from that, I wondered, now that you've actually written a book, how do you feel about, because you felt this angst before about memoir, you abandoned a memoir project, you've kind of gone book essays. Yeah, I'm wondering now that you've got a book out, how has your thought thinking changed around this idea of memoir and also confession?
I think that, these are clearly still personal essays, but they kind of felt like they struck a different kind of balance than a traditional memoir project. I'm just thinking, what interest could dogs possibly have in me? That's why they're so bored right now. They're very cute though. Yes. I think that when I was writing that memoir, I kept feeling, actually, Miro puts it really well. Let me just see if I can find this page, and then you kind of talk about this kind of shame that comes from overly exposing yourself, or moments of vulnerability that lead to this kind of strange feeling, like you almost feel a shame hangover. I don't know how else to put it, but I tabbed sections about this. I've written shame after self-exposure. And I really love this line where you say, you learn to live with assaulting vulnerability, to let its snowstorm snow you, its fear frighten you, its diablo bedevil you, and pass on. I think that I just really enjoyed that. Because, yeah, inevitably, whatever decisions, curatorial decisions we make about how much to disclose and how to disclose, etc., inevitably this is deeply exposing stuff that we do. And I'm not trying to glamorize it, you know, other people have harder jobs, no doubt. But you kind of find a way to compartmentalize, or I don't know, kind of make your peace with it. And I'm aware I'm not necessarily answering your question, Sheila. I guess my answer is, yeah, personal essays felt different because they weren't just about me, they were kind of about a clear set of ethical concerns I had about, you know, class and diaspora and race. And writing personal essays enabled me to make kind of broader social and cultural critical commentary. And I didn't feel that I could kind of get at that through memoir necessarily. And I also read a lot of like political theory because I'm also like a PhD student in politics, which is very irrelevant to what I do in writing, but it just is the majority of what I read, and I feel that that stuff is always on my mind, and I always reach for quotes, which you'll see in the book if you choose to read it. I'm always reaching for quotes from theorists, and I don't know, I just felt that memoir couldn't help me get at this kind of hybridity that I was searching for.
I mean, I think maybe you're busting to say something, Miro, but I mean, what do you think about that? Because, I mean, I'm a little bit suspicious of theory sometimes, even though I'm doing a PhD as well. I think we're all doing this, but I think though that I guess it sort of creates a bit of distance when you know, with the essay form, you can bring in other sources, you can lean on other people and other thinkers, so it protects you a little bit. But maybe I would disagree that, you know, I mean, Miro's book, I think, is a lot about class and a lot about some of those same concerns that you have, but you, I think, were quite, I guess, very careful to just really focus on memoir. I mean, did you have the same concerns when you were writing this, or did you come from a different place?
Yeah, I mean, I did come from there's definite crossovers, and I loved the hybridity of your memoir, essay, class analysis. I mean, it's just very, very brilliant, and I felt slightly wordless. I thought, oh my God, I won't be able to say anything on this panel because it's so articulate, and in a very different language from mine. But I guess the sort of narcissism factor, the shame hangover, the sort of pitfalls of memoir. There was a thing in my book, I guess, that also is a series of portraits of other people, and that was a very strong drive in writing it. I was trying to capture quite a self-mythologizing tribe and cast of people, most of whom I hadn't seen for, 30 or 3 decades and had no contact with. So there was that. It was the looking outwards. It was quite looking outwards. And also what Addi says about the lived experience of the working class. I don't exactly name that in my book, but most of the characters in my book are inside that experience as well. So that resonated really strongly with me. And I actually, Elena Savage is another one who I just love reading her essays where she actually writes down the actual sums of, what she is earning in the gig economy or for a review, or and that's probably one of the only things I regret, that I left the sums out of my book. It's probably too long ago for me to remember them. I think it's sort of really brilliant when that stuff is exposed, because it's such a powerful reality that goes undiscussed. It's such an element of lived experience. Anyway, just sort of
so I think that's where Addi, I mean, there's more of the telling, I guess, and yours is more the showing. But I mean, Addi does both though. So so that's why Addi's gone from a hybrid model where there's a lot of memoir though still, even though there's a lot of actual kind of theory and other analysis alongside it.
Yeah, and I don't mean to imply that memoirs are self-indulgent or anything like that. I think just for me, I was finding that when I was writing more exposing work, I was having that shame hangover and that kind of, it was, I think, just myself telling me that it was an excessive amount of sharing. And I think that as much as we kind of culturally place a premium on sharing, we kind of also need to find ways to define boundaries and limits around it, because the market because inevitably as writers we are part of a market. You know, it is work, as Ella is very adept at pointing out. You know, we do this for money. Not a lot of money, but for money. Well, there's money involved. What I'm saying is, it's like,
very small sums of money.
You could not write it for money.
right, but what I mean is that I think that there is a demand for kind of the tell-all, and that's what that particular essay is about. I'm not saying that we are kind of stepping into that market space willingly, but I think that what kind of gets asked, especially from young writers and female writers and people of color, is, you know, give us your trauma, give us your whatever, so that we may mine it. And I think that we kind of need to catch ourselves a little bit sometimes. So I've just tried to have this healthy dose of suspicion when it comes to the quote-unquote overshare. And yeah, we define those limits for ourselves. I would never judge anyone's choice to share or whatever it is that they choose to share.
But wait, what you're referring to, and I guess the title, you know, inside the confession machine, is a kind of machine as well. And I guess that's the first person industrial complex, if you've heard that expression, that's sort of at work here. And that's why, I mean, memoir has become a very dominant form in nonfiction, I guess, in recent years. It's what we've become quite used to reading, especially like because the internet really kind of put that onto us. But I guess one thing I'll say is that, I mean, I'm personally also very conflicted about writing memoir, and I think I lean to personal essay because I feel like it protects me a little bit as well. And maybe there's that shame aspect, especially when it comes to talking about your family. And I think that's particularly hard as well. But your books also changed my mind. This is where, like, and then I doubt myself when I read books like yours, because they're very valuable, because both of you are actually witnesses. So like Miro, you're witnessing an era that's already passed, like a particular community that lived for a while and then disappeared, they don't exist anymore.
Well, they're barely on the public record. You know, I really felt a strong sense of writing into the unwritten.
Yeah, it's quite anthropological, I think, your approach. I mean, and so is Edda, and then Edda, I mean, this is what I guess I personally read to Edda, but, and Edda also is writing about a community that, you know, is kind of unprecedented in history, like, you know, I guess Turkish Australians, to kind of describe it that way, who are an ongoing kind of diaspora too, and they're not Turkish anymore, not quite Australian, whatever that means. And so I think there's a kind of witnessing you're doing, and I just wondered, is that what you're thinking too? Are you thinking that you're a witness to this?
Well, yeah, it seems to me like Miro was very important to you to be a witness, and I felt like I was saying this yesterday at another panel where I feel like when I was writing memoir, it was me kind of restlessly searching for a witness of me. I was seeking to be witnessed, and I think that wasn't the right kind of writing for me, as I discussed. You know, forcing someone to look at something and say, look at this, doesn't mean that you were really having the right kind of like reparative or generative witnessing that we all search for. So yeah, I think that when writers are trying to help others feel witnessed, then that feels like a more productive space than when we are searching for a witness. Maybe that's kind of a false binary that I've set up, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but I mean, I guess that's what occurs to me anyway, that like that's where I do come back to memoir, thinking that there's still value in documenting these things, these kind of unwritten histories or underwritten histories, and also then being able to just, you know, I guess history sort of unfolds, you know, as we're kind of living it, and it seems important in some way. I mean, I don't know, I mean, maybe it doesn't matter, maybe this stuff decades from now, you know, it would just be kind of evolved into something else, but I think both your books are really important testimonies, and so I think from that perspective, like, there's so much value in what you've written. I don't know if there's any questions. I'm conscious of time, and you know, our panels are a little bit shorter. But I guess I just wanted to ask about questions of form though as well. I mean, we talked about the essay a little bit, and I wondered, Miro, that, I mean, even though your book's like a memoir, it's actually written like as hundreds of vignettes, and I wondered why you opted for that form rather than just like, well, I mean, you basically do start from childhood though, more or less, and sort of going through to your adult life. But why did you sort of end up, you know, using the form that you did?
Well, actually, really when I started this memoir, and I sort of don't see it as a tell-all. There's an enormous amount of screen. I'm very interested in what's not said, what can't be said, what's omitted. I come from being a prose poet, so you're always distilling, you're leaving out. It's the way my mind works. I'm not an encyclopedia kind of brain. So I was coming from the prose poet, which is really probably, you think, in page-long chunks. That's how the prose falls out. It's only got my childhood in there because it was, I sent it off to an agent who wanted to know, it was really just 3 years of my life. The 3 years which were the hippie commune years, or sort of the counterculture years. I didn't want to write anything before or after, and I sent it to an agent. And she sent me back these the kind of notes you get in the film industry that I left the film industry to escape from, which were all about character arcs and lessons learnt and development and backstory. And I was just furious and felt really ill, and then went away and thought I better have a go, and came up with the sections which are very, very glimpses of a childhood world. So in that way, I don't think of it as tell-all because there's so much omitted. And I was also just writing for the joy of sentences. I have to say, I'm not really I'm never writing with a message. I don't know what I want to say. I'm writing to find out. And I'm writing from that, just trying to find the word container, just trying to find that fantastic, weird magic. And when you get the right run of words, you get the right rhythm, and it's sort of musical and it's physical. And so I do write, it's quite in my body. So I'm writing for the absolutely selfish joy of that. And I feel like, probably like a musician, if I feel I can get that right, then somebody else will feel it in a similar way. And it could be anything. And I just want to say about the shame hangover that I would have that if I was writing about, king penguins, really. It's something to do with putting my voice on the page and it going out into the world. It's actually nothing to do with the content, weirdly.
That's interesting. Now,
Just an aside.
Yeah. Is that how you feel about it too? Yes. In terms of that joy, because your book, I think your book is very good at articulating your anxieties and your struggles, and there's a lot of humour as well. But I wondered if you kind of relate to that description of writing. Like, do you feel that joy when you write?
Yeah, I think most of us kind of write because it feels like mainlining heroin a little bit, like when you're really in it, Why do I say that as if that's something? When I have a really satisfying session of writing, when I'm able to be fully gripped and absorbed in what I'm doing, it truly is one of life's few pleasures, I would say. To the point where maybe that subsequent process of publication becomes not as relevant. Yes, you kind of feel that another pang of pleasure from the knowledge that someone else is sharing a moment with you, or something that you did, and it's helping them feel. We all want to see that other people are having feelings as a result of us, whatever they may be. That's one way of confirming that we're alive, I think. But I do really think that you're right, Miro. Your book is, of course, you're right, you're the expert on your work, but each sentence takes longer to read, I think, because each one is so packed and full of images, and I think that were this written not by a prose poet, it would be so much longer. So your book kind of lands like dark matter in the best way possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description. Did anyone have any questions? Otherwise we might wrap it up.
I have a question. It's quite interesting what you spoke about the notion of shame and all of that stuff when you were writing. My first question is, what actually made you to write about those deep secrets, in your personal life, family life, and then did that have a different impact after you actually put it out there? Do you feel a sense of liberation, and what kind of has impacted in you interpersonal communication later on in terms of authenticity, and being in general.
Big question.
Oh gosh. God, it's just you have so many mixed, there's so many. I mean, so, oh, microphone, sorry. I didn't say anything significant.
You're just stunned, actually.
Yeah, because there's just not one answer to that. But I felt pretty light after. I didn't have any regrets, actually. I had all the regrets when I was writing. So lots of cold sweats. I think I sort of did a lot of that work while I was writing it.
Yeah, I think at the end it kind of becomes an object that's
It
fully
does,
externalized.
separate from you.
Yeah, it's like, maybe that is catharsis in a way, but yeah, it kind of becomes its own artifact. It's no longer me, it's this thing that was written by this other person who also happens to be named Edda, but it's kind of like, it's like giving birth, and then that baby has its own independence and autonomy.
You don't see it very often.
Nothing to do with me, exactly, that's right.
You're gonna look after it.
Yeah.
Did you have a question? One last question.
I will say though, I didn't have the shame with this one. I will say I didn't have the shame hangover with this one, which is pretty weird because it's the most personal one. So there's a puzzle.
Maybe, maybe it's also you're older now, so I definitely felt there was a sense of someone older and wiser and mature writing about their younger self.
Yeah, it was the right time. Timing is a pretty big thing when you're writing, and I couldn't have approached this earlier. There would have been too much blame and
Quick question, yeah.
It makes sense that you would feel that it was something from you by the end of that process, but what about friends or family who lived through those times with you?
Yeah, we didn't go there.
Well, I got a lot of letters. I had this sort of weird thing where I was writing about another country, literally, and also in time. So it was, it was 40 years previous, and I just had this total delusion that no one would read the book. None of them would read the book. They all read the book, and they all told each other about it and passed it on, and most of them wrote to me. I didn't get the recrimination I expected. I heard of a few tantrums sort of off screen, but they were always by people that hadn't read the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always think about an anecdote that I think Vanessa's actually here literally, but should I repeat this anecdote? Anyway, it's just kind of like someone who I'll de-identify published a book that kind of made a very mundane comment about a radio host that wasn't really even mean or offensive, and then that radio host saw it and was like, fuck you, basically. And it kind of crystallized for me that you can't ever really predict how people are going to respond to typically I vetted what I can with the people who are in this book, but the reality is that if you're talking about a figure who has done unideal thing,
Abusive, even?
Right, someone who's committed harm is never going to be like, oh, thanks for publishing that was amazing. So inevitably, people aren't going to be happy with how they're represented, but I hope it becomes clear from the text that I kind of have like a golden rule, which is that the person who should seem like an asshole the most is me, because I'm the one who's chosen to enter into this. So I would hope that the person who's exposed most is myself.
I think I felt that too. I felt most of it rebounded on me above all. Though that might be a delusion because my mother and my father are both, they're all writers. So my mother and father gave me permission, really, carte blanche. But then my mother and my sister have refused to read it. And only my father sort of accepts it. So it's a bit of a no-go zone. Yeah.
If you want to talk to Miro more about that, she'll be at the desk, and so will Edda. So
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.